As we continue with the topic of faith as we conclude our journey through Lent, this week's reading in Isaiah reminds us that sometimes it is not always easy to retain faith when we are threatened by the storms of life and the crashing waves of suffering and pain which fall heavily upon us. And though it's challenging to cling to our faith in times of trouble, thankfully Isaiah reminds us that during our times of weakness, God is working in the background to intervene and provide assurance that we are not alone. In our reading from Isaiah 43, which is part of a larger section of Isaiah's letter which addresses the community's concern that God abandoned them in their time of suffering, the prophet writes to the enslaved Hebrews in Babylon who've lost everything: their land, their homes, their livelihoods, their families, and to some extent, they felt they had lost their connection to God as well. They are knocked about by a storm. As the storm constantly invaded their lives, their faith began to diminish. They wondered where God was in the midst of disaster and what God had in mind for their future. We might have similar questions when we face storms in our lives, like when an accident occurs with tragic results, or when our health fails, or someone around us becomes seriously ill. It is tough retaining faith when a child falls down a flight of stairs and is injured, or when our faith is tossed about on the sea of chaos when we receive troubling news from our physician, and the list goes on. When bad things happen, it's not easy to retain faith, believing that anything positive could emerge from the depths of pain and suffering. And it's tough to convince ourselves that God will rescue us from the storm-tossed sea we find ourselves submerged in. It is to our stormy situation and the one the Hebrews suffered that Isaiah proclaims, God's activity will be with you. And he does this by utilizing the events recorded in the Exodus story. Isaiah reminded the Hebrews that when their ancestors had their backs up against the wall, pursued by the Egyptian army, as they attempted to escape, God was the one who made a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters. Though the Hebrews thought there was no way out, and the people lacking faith began lashing out at God and Moses in anger because they believed Moses had led them out to the desert so they could be massacred beside the Red Sea, God provided a breakthrough for the people. God parted the sea, and the people ran on dry ground to the other side. Then, liberated as the Egyptian army followed in pursuit, the ocean walls collapsed and caused the horse, army, and warrior to lie down, unable to rise, quenched like a wick. This is the good news of God who continues to make a way where there is no way. Throughout Scripture, repeatedly we see God's activity in the world which can stabilize our faith when we are storm-tossed, so that assured God is with us, we live into our discipleship of care for each other. For instance, when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, thousands of people died and over 400,000 homes were destroyed. Reverend Gadiel Rios says, at first he was shocked as he watched people around him lash out at each other, attempting to wall themselves off from others to protect themselves and their possessions while ignoring the needs of their neighbors. He watched as violence and anger seemed to crash into the community like a giant wave, and he confesses that his faith began to diminish as he watched the community around him essentially self-destruct after the hurricane struck. In his view, he said everyone was angry at God, and they lashed out at each other violently. In addition, he had his own worries. The devastation of their community meant they would have to rebuild, but where would they find the labor? And where would the financial assistance come from? He also became fearful that the community of faith would disappear, worrying what would happen with the community of faith he ministered in. Thankfully, though there were ongoing reports of violence, Pastor Gadiel discovered God's ability to miraculously break through to offer hope and redemption to the people. Pastor Gadiel said that a few days after the storm, members of his congregation arrived at the church property and they prayed together. After worshiping God, they left the church and stopped to assist persons who lived around the church to help their needs. The congregation recognized that they had a responsibility to follow Jesus' example as they helped someone else recover, even though they had not restored their own homes, and many didn't even have the utilities restored. Pastor Gadio said that a crisis like this brought us back to the core of our calling, as God intervened and supplied a path in the mighty waters. The members of his congregation recalled that Jesus commissioned the church to be people living in true community, loving God and loving their spiritual brothers and sisters, and loving the lost souls. God's ability to redeem and restore us is fascinating, especially when God can utilize the storms we experience to transform lives, as lives were transformed following the hurricane in Puerto Rico. God can take a tragic event and provide life-changing transformations as we break through the storm, guided by God. Isaiah reminds us that God is capable of intervening on our behalf to change hearts and open minds, so even though a tragic event took place, God can utilize to create good, as God did in Charlottesville. If you recall, 2 years ago, a group of persons gathered in Charlottesville for a Unite the Right rally, which was a thinly veiled attempt to be a political group, but the ugly reality was that the rally had been orchestrated by white power hate groups. One of the men who orchestrated this rally was a former Grand Dragon of the KKK, Ken Parker. But he says he quit that group because it was not hateful enough and became a prominent leader in the American Nazi Party. Ken intentionally led a group of tiki-bearing marchers through predominant black neighborhoods, claiming that he hoped to spark a race war. At the end of the demonstration, as we know, a youth inspired by these hateful words he heard shouted, drove his car intentionally into a group and killed a young woman. Ironically, though Ken said he wanted a race war and he used violent slogans about hurting people, he says he didn't mean that anyone should actually be killed because of the color of their skin. Though the community was engaged in a storm by this racist demonstration, Ken felt the ground open beneath him and within himself as he had his own type of storm. He found himself swallowed up by a sea of guilt, and the storm only worsened for him when he attempted to flee this feeling of guilt by masking it with hatred and racism. Immediately after the young girl was killed, he attempted to provoke an African-American reporter, hoping that she would respond with anger herself, thus justifying his racism, justifying the reason why that youth should have been killed. But the storm clouds continued to grow thicker because she never matched his hate for hate. Instead, even though he shouted vile things at her, she remained courteous and respectfully asked questions about his life and why he came to Charlottesville. He was unable to escape his guilt for being part of that group that inspired a youth to kill someone. And daily the storm within him worsened as he felt wave after wave of shame and guilt crash into him. And finally, while at home in Florida, God offered a path for him to leave the storm. Ken met one of his neighbors, William McKinnon, an African-American pastor. And after multiple discussions, Ken found God, and last summer was baptized by Pastor William. Today, Ken is an active member at All Saints Holiness Church, a mostly black church. And Ken has been utilizing his recent transformation to testify about how God's redemptive power rescued him from a meaningless life. He's been reaching out to Klan members, American Nazis, and skinheads to help them find God, and he prays they will be transformed for God's glory as well. You know, it's incredible how God can reach into tragic moments and storms and utilize these moments to provide transformation. Not only for ourselves, but others as well. God is able to change the lives of racists and drug addicts. God can transform acts of violence into acts of care and service. God can provide a way where we once thought there was no way. And God removes obstacles to provide a path through the storm where we can discover peace. Though to be honest, storms are not easy. They are challenging and test our faith. But as Isaiah and Jesus remind us with their writings and with their lives, with faith we can walk through those stormy moments. We are called by Jesus to walk on stormy waves where we can see God's power revealed, because God has the power to part the sea. God has the power to make rivers flow in the desert. God has power to make water pour from a rock. God has the power to transform sinners into saints, and God has the power to restore life. In our reading in Isaiah, it concludes with a striking statement that the ultimate purpose of God's activity is to offer a breakthrough so we will declare God's praise. And as we prepare for Easter, we recall an incredible breakthrough of God's activity through Jesus' resurrection, when Jesus was restored to life, and through him we receive life. We also recognize during this Easter season that God still has the power to deliver us from the storm and offer breakthroughs that change lives and transforms unbelievers into believers. One such incredible modern breakthrough story that proclaims God's awesome ability to transform lives, even in the face of storms, will appear in theaters nationwide in 2 weeks. On April 17th, a movie called Breakthrough will be released, starring Chrissy Metz, the star of NBC's television show, This Is Us. The film is based on the nonfiction book, The Impossible, which follows the terrifying moment when a 14-year-old named John Smith fell through the ice in Missouri while playing with some friends on a lake. As the promotional materials and trailers for the film reveal, so no spoiler alerts here, since the trailer already has given you information, John was trapped under the ice for nearly half an hour as first responders who had just recently completed ice rescue training a week before the accident struggled to search the bottom of the lake. One of the first responders, Tommy Shine, is portrayed in the film as an atheist who denies God's existence, yet is unable to explain that while in the water searching for John, he felt a nudge, which caused him to turn around to find John on the bottom of the lake. Then in the days that followed, when Tommy visited John's family in the hospital, he watched amazed as the teen defied medical explanation for returning to life, and later making a full recovery. Eventually, there's a breakthrough moment for Tommy as he finally realized that God was in the water, not only with himself and John, but for the whole rescue team. Tommy says he had his own storm, and God provided a path for him to find transformation and peace. God was able to utilize a terrifying moment, and Tommy isn't the only one transformed. The whole faith community discovered their purpose to exist, and the pastor of the church found renewed strength for his faith as he reported this on NBC News when they were talking about the movie. Even the doctors and nurses who were involved in John's case found their faith increasing as they were led through a common storm. These multiple breakthroughs reveal God's miraculous power, all because God was able to provide a path through the storm toward peace. And the people renewed their faith in Jesus who walks with us on the stormy seas. These breakthroughs are able to restore and strengthen our faith as well. Because as we know from Isaiah and Jesus, that when storms threaten our lives, God remains with us. When storms invade, with faith, we learn to trust that Jesus is with us and travels with us through the storm. That God's glorious presence is still present even when we are distracted by the flashing lightning and the raging sea. With our eyes fixed on God, we can help others defeat their doubts. Because like the Hebrews of Babylon, we can reveal to others that God remains with us the entire time to help us walk on the crashing waves. And though not everyone has a miraculous recovery like John Smith, Isaiah reminds us that in those tragic moments when our faith is stretched nearly to the breaking point, it reminds us to use our eyes of faith to see what God is doing in our lives and in the lives of others. And though it may be difficult to see since the storm is messy, causing messy lives, we are assured that something new will spring forth and that not all is lost. Out of sorrow and of pain, we can be the bearers for faith to provide others with faith, which can help transform a life, the life of others, and even our own. These storms can help us discover our faith growth, especially when we are called to walk on the stormy water with Jesus, leaving the boat of safety and security. When storms approach, we are encouraged to remain faithful, and sometimes we will be asked to step out of the boat and risk everything for God. Being faithful when the world is falling apart, and remaining loyal to God when storms crash upon us and the oceans rise. As the storms attack and rise, we are encouraged to remember that God's almighty power has the ability to help us walk on water, to provide care for strangers and care for our neighbors. As we exit the storms with Jesus, we will discover the paths that God has created for us so we connect with those who have struggled and whose feet may have failed when the waves crashed onto them. In this way, we tap into God's power as we, along with others, discover God's mighty care which remains present even during a tragedy. Remaining faithful, even when it doesn't make sense or it seems impossible for us to survive, we will see God's glory revealed as God guides us through tragedy to something new. We're invited to walk on the waves where feet may fail, yet we are assured Jesus will deliver us to safety with Him. Trusting God and following where God guides us, we are called to join Jesus on the stormy sea. Faithfully walk with Him to go where lost and hurting souls splash around seeking assistance. But you are the life jacket. You are the help that God provides. Recognizing that God can transform lives, even in the midst of storms, we are called to be a church that walks on water, praying that God will lead me where my trust is without borders, to take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and make my faith stronger, and my soul will rest in God's embrace. Let us be that church that walks on water, retaining faith and helping those who struggle. I invite you to join with me in prayer. Holy God, you are our lifeguard. You seek the lost. You watch the waves. You scan the oceans, and you watch over us. Lord, guide us gently with your touch and direct us. Lord, as you provide care for us, refresh us by streams of living water. Embrace us in your care and tend to our wounds. Supply us with life jackets. Protect us from danger. Rescue us when we wander. Search for us when we are lost. In your presence is joy forevermore. In your care is life abundant. In your keeping is rest. And in your path is peace. Lord, you are the lifeguard of our lives and souls. Provide us with a life jacket as we answer your call and trust your faithfulness as we remain faithful to you. And all God's people said, Amen. Responding to Christ's invitation to come out and walk on the waves, I invite you to stand as you're able to sing.